For millennia, we have believed that spiritual progress was the domain of ascetic men isolated from the world. Monks in monasteries, hermits in caves, sages atop mountains. The image we have of spiritual evolution is predominantly male, solitary, and disconnected from everyday life. But what if this narrative is fundamentally mistaken? What if, while civilization advances through technological revolutions and social transformations, we are witnessing a profound shift that is rarely mentioned? What if women, historically marginalized from formal centers of spiritual power, are in fact leading a silent revolution that could redefine what we understand as spiritual advancement and human consciousness? Think for a moment about how you've internalized this idea. How, without question, we've accepted the notion that spiritual elevation requires withdrawal from ordinary life and almost complete detachment from human relationships, a transcendence that often seems incompatible with the daily responsibilities that sustain our communities. And who, throughout history, has carried the weight of these daily responsibilities? Who has kept the social fabric intact while great spiritual masters sought enlightenment in isolation? Women have been the invisible guardians of human continuity, developing a form of consciousness that does not reject the world, but embraces it in its complexity. Perhaps the true spiritual revolution does not come from those who seek to escape the bonds of material existence, but from those who have learned to find transcendence within immanence, elevation within commitment, not despite it. If we look back through human history, we notice a curious pattern. While dominant spiritual traditions led by men often portray enlightenment as a path of transcending the human condition, spiritual practices associated with women tend to emphasize the sacredness of immanence, the spiritual dignity of the body and the earth, the holiness of birth and nurturing. In the caves of Lascaux, more than 17,000 years ago, we find evidence of shamanic rituals where women seem to have played central roles connecting human communities with natural cycles and the rhythms of the earth. In the ancient civilizations of Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt, priestesses maintained spiritual traditions that celebrated life instead of seeking to transcend it. Even in traditions that eventually became patriarchal, such as early Hinduism, we find traces of belief systems centered on the feminine divine, on women's wisdom as oracles, healers, and mediators between worlds. What happened to these traditions? Why were they marginalized, erased, or rewritten? As human societies became more hierarchical, militarized, and urbanized, we witnessed a gradual yet persistent devaluation of feminine forms of spirituality. The religions that emerged during the Axial Age, between 800 and 200 BCE, a period that saw the rise of Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism, and the reforms of Hinduism and Judaism, tended to formalize religious structures that excluded women from positions of spiritual authority. The path to enlightenment became codified in texts written by men, interpreted by men, and taught in institutions run by men. And yet, despite this systemic marginalization, women never stopped developing their own spiritual traditions, often hidden in plain sight in the everyday practices of care, healing, and communion. Consider the beginnings of medieval Europe women who created independent spiritual communities outside the control of the church. or the traditional healers of West Africa preserving ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants and ritual practices that sustain the health of both body and spirit, or the practitioners of folk religions in Asia who keep alive ancient cults of female deities even within nominally patriarchal religious framework. What all these traditions have in common is an approach to spirituality that does not seek to escape the world, but to transform it through conscious presence. A spirituality that does not view the body as an obstacle to enlightenment, but as a sacred vessel for human experience. A spirituality that finds the divine not only in the abstract heights of philosophical thought, but in the concreteness of human relationships, in the cultivation of the earth, in the creation of resilient communities. But why does this matter now? Why, in the 21st century, do we need to revisit these marginalized traditions and recognize the revolutionary potential of women-centered spirituality? The answer lies in the unprecedented challenges we face as a species. We are in the midst of an existential crisis that threatens not only our civilization, but the very biosphere that sustains all life on Earth. Technological and economic solutions are necessary but insufficient. What we need is a profound transformation in human consciousness, a shift in how we relate to one another and to the natural world. And it is precisely here that the spiritual wisdom developed by women over millennia becomes not just relevant, but essential. The qualities that have traditionally been devalued as feminine are exactly what we must collectively cultivate if we are to survive and thrive as a species. The capacity to care, to nurture connections, to think in terms of interdependent systems rather than rigid hierarchies, the ability to see the world not as a resource to be exploited, but as a web of relationships to be respected. The wisdom to find balance between action and receptivity, between transformation and conservation, between innovation and reverence for tradition. In fact, it is no coincidence that as women gain more voice and influence across societies, we are witnessing a resurgence of spiritual approaches that emphasize precisely these qualities. From ecofeminists leading global environmental movements to mindfulness teachers bringing contemplative practices into schools and workplaces, from indigenous leaders defending the rights of their lands and peoples, to social entrepreneurs redesigning business through values of sustainability and care. In all these domains, we see women bringing forth a spiritual sensibility that integrates rather than fragments, that connects rather than divides. But it would be a mistake to think that this spiritual revolution is only for or about women. What we are witnessing is the re-emergence of a balance that was disrupted millennia ago, a reintegration of qualities that were artificially divided and assigned to different genders, as if humanity could be split in half and remain whole. Men and women and those who do not identify strictly with either category all have access to this integral wisdom. All can learn to cultivate a consciousness that honors both transcendence and immanence, both action and receptivity, both individuality and communion. Consider how our contemporary crises stem precisely from this imbalance. Our ecological crisis arises from a worldview that sees nature as separate from us, a resource to be dominated rather than a living community of which we are a part. Our mental health crisis arises from cultures that value productivity over well-being, competition over collaboration, status over meaningful connection. Our political crisis stems from systems that reward domination instead of cooperation, polarization instead of dialogue, rigid certainty instead of compassionate curiosity. In each case, the qualities traditionally associated with feminine spirituality offer not just an antidote, but a path to genuine transformation. And what's remarkable is that these qualities are increasingly validated by contemporary science. Neuroscience is demonstrating how empathy and compassion can be cultivated through contemplative practice. Psychology is documenting the benefits of mindfulness and self-compassion for mental health. Ecology is confirming what many indigenous traditions, often led by women, have always known: that the health of ecosystems depends on relationships of reciprocity and mutual respect. In other words, what was once dismissed as women's intuition or folk wisdom is being revealed as a sophisticated understanding of how complex systems function, whether they are ecosystems, human communities, or our own minds. This is a form of knowledge that does not separate the observer from the observed, that does not sacrifice depth for precision, that understands that some truths can only be accessed through participation and engagement, not through analytical distance. And yet, it would be naive to suggest that this women-led spiritual revolution is advancing without resistance. In fact, we are witnessing fierce backlash precisely because established power structures feel threatened by this shift in consciousness. When women begin to reclaim their spiritual authority, when they question traditions that have marginalized them, when they create new forms of practice that honor their lived experiences, the established hierarchies are inevitably challenged. We see this backlash in fundamentalist religious movements seeking to reinforce rigid gender roles. We see it in political attacks on women's reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. We see it in smear campaigns against female leaders across sectors, from politics to business, from academia to the arts. These are not isolated phenomena, but part of a larger pattern of resistance to a fundamental transformation in human consciousness. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this spiritual future we're discussing most awakens your interest or hope? Have you ever wondered whether the dominant spiritual traditions truly resonate with your lived experience? I know that many of us often keep these reflections to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of questioning established structures or seeming less spiritual for not fitting traditional molds. But your insights are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My hope for the spiritual future of humanity is. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these emerging possibilities rather than confining ourselves to well-trodden paths. And perhaps by naming these hopes together, we can begin to manifest them more consciously in our lives and communities. What makes this spiritual revolution particularly powerful is that it is not taking place only in monasteries or temples, but in every domain of human life. We are witnessing spiritually awakened women transforming the way we do business with a growing emphasis on purpose beyond profit, on well-being beyond productivity, on sustainability beyond growth at any cost. We see them reshaping education, bringing contemplative practices into classrooms, helping children develop not only cognitive skills, but emotional intelligence and embodied wisdom. We see them transforming social activism, replacing confrontational tactics with approaches that honor the humanity of everyone involved, even those regarded as opponents. In each case, these women are demonstrating a form of leadership that is not based on domination, but on facilitation, one that does not seek to control, but to cultivate, one that does not impose visions from the top down, but nurtures the collective wisdom that emerges when people are genuinely empowered. This is a kind of power that does not diminish others, but amplifies them. Power with, not power over. A power that grows through sharing, not accumulation. And what is most remarkable is that this form of spiritual leadership requires no formal credentials or official positions. It does not depend on titles such as guru, teacher, or priestess. It manifests in the daily actions of ordinary women living with intentionality and presence. The mother raising her children with mindful awareness, teaching them by example how to live with compassion and authenticity. The teacher creating a safe space where her students can explore not only facts, but meaning and purpose. The nurse bringing a healing presence to every encounter with her patients, seeing them not merely as bodies to be repaired, but as whole beings worthy of respect and reverence. This kind of embodied spirituality, wisdom, expressed through concrete actions rather than philosophical abstractions, has always been the domain of women. And now, as the world faces crises that no technology alone can solve, this wisdom is being recognized not as secondary or complementary to the true spirituality of mystics and philosophers, but as an equally valid and possibly more relevant expression of human evolution. Consider how this women-led spiritual revolution is transforming our understanding of fundamental concepts. Take the concept of power, for example. Male-dominated spiritual traditions have often portrayed spiritual power as the ability to transcend human limitations, to conquer desires and attachments, to master mind and body through ascetic discipline. In contrast, women-centered spirituality tends to view power not as domination, but as generative capacity, not as transcendence of limitations, but as creative transformation within them, not as the conquest of the world, but as conscious participation in its ongoing evolution. Or consider the concept of enlightenment. In male-dominated traditions, enlightenment is often depicted as a final state of realization, a peak of consciousness that once reached separates the enlightened one from worldly concerns. Women-centered spirituality, on the other hand, tends to see enlightenment not as a final destination, but as a quality of engagement, not as a state to be attained, but as a way of participation, not as transcendence of relationships, but as their transformation. Even the concept of spiritual practice is being reimagined. In male-led traditions, spiritual practice usually involves dedicated periods of meditation, study, or ritual set apart from daily activity. Women-centered spirituality, in contrast, tends to see every aspect of life as an opportunity for practice and cultivation. Preparing a meal can be as profound a practice as meditation. Raising a child can be as transformative as a silent retreat. Building community can be as enlightening as studying sacred texts. What is emerging in other words, is not merely greater inclusion of women within existing spiritual traditions, though that is also happening and is important, but a fundamental redefinition of what it means to be a spiritual being in the modern world. A redefinition that does not reject the valuable insights of established traditions, but integrates them into a broader understanding that honors the wholeness of human experience. And what makes this spiritual revolution particularly suited to our time is that it directly responds to the specific challenges we face as a species. In an age of social fragmentation and political polarization, women-centered spirituality emphasizes connection and community. In an age of ecological collapse, it insists on interdependence and sustainability. In an age of unprecedented technological acceleration, it reminds us of the wisdom of the body and the importance of natural rhythm. In an age of growing inequality, it affirms the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of status or productivity. This is no coincidence. The very qualities that were marginalized along with women are precisely the ones we now need to recover collectively if we are to navigate the interwoven crisis of our time. And the women who kept these qualities alive, often at great personal cost, are now the bearers of a wisdom that may show the way toward a more sustainable and equitable future. But this spiritual revolution is not only about saving the world, it is also about personal transformation, about reclaiming an integrity that has been fragmented by centuries of dualism, about healing the artificial split between mind and body, reason and emotion, individual and community, humanity and nature. Splits that have not only distorted our spiritual traditions, but also caused immense suffering in our personal lives. The women leading this spiritual revolution are showing us how to live in a more integrated and authentic way, how to honor both our agency and our receptivity, both our autonomy and our interdependence, both our uniqueness and our belonging to something greater than ourselves. They are showing that spirituality need not be an escape from life, but a deeper immersion in it, not a rejection of the world, but a fuller commitment to it. And perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this women-centered spirituality is its emphasis on vulnerability as a source of strength, not weakness. In a world that prizes invulnerability, that celebrates those who never show doubt or uncertainty, that rewards the appearance of total control, these women are demonstrating the transformative power of acknowledging our limitations, admitting our interdependence, and being open to the unknown. This is an understanding of power radically different from the one that dominates our cultures. A power that does not arise from imposing the will, but from harmonizing with forces greater than ourselves. A power that does not seek to control the flow of life, but to navigate it wisely. A power that recognizes that true strength does not come from rigidity, but from resilience, not from resisting change, but from the ability to adapt and evolve. Consider the central paradox of our time. On the one hand, we have developed technologies of unprecedented power. We can edit the genetic code of life. We can alter the global climate. We can create artificial intelligences that rival human capacities in ever-widening domains. And yet, despite all this technological power, we feel collectively powerless before the challenges we face, unable to cooperate effectively, paralyzed by political and ideological division, trapped in systems that seem to have taken on a life of their own beyond conscious human control. The spiritual wisdom cultivated by women offers a way beyond this paradox. It suggests that true power does not come from ever greater technological capabilities, but from a deeper understanding of how complex systems truly work. Not from more control, but from more conscious participation. Not from dominating nature, but from collaborating with its inherent processes. On an individual level, we see this wisdom embodied in women who are redefining success on their own terms, refusing to sacrifice well-being and meaningful connection on the altar of productivity and status. On a community level, we see it in women-led initiatives, creating more resilient local economies, more sustainable food systems, and stronger networks of care. On a global level, we see it in women-led movements for climate justice, indigenous rights, and conflict transformation. At every level, what these spiritually awakened women are demonstrating is not merely a different set of policies or practices, but a fundamentally different way of being in the world, one that does not separate theory and practice, contemplation and action, personal growth and social transformation. One that understands that how we do things is as important as what we do, that the ends cannot be separated from the means, and that the process is as essential as the outcome. This is a wisdom long dismissed as merely feminine, as secondary to the real business of politics, economics, and technology. But as these supposedly masculine domains continue to generate seemingly insoluble crises, this feminine wisdom is increasingly being recognized as essential, not peripheral, as foundational, not complementary, as the very core of what it means to be a consciously evolving human being in the 21st century. And what makes this spiritual revolution particularly powerful is that it does not demand dramatic conversion or complete rupture with the past. It does not ask us to reject all the wisdom of existing spiritual traditions, but to view them through a wider, more inclusive lens, to recognize the ways in which these traditions were distorted by patriarchy, and to reclaim the aspects that were suppressed or marginalized. In fact, in all the great spiritual traditions, we can find underground currents that deeply resonate with this woman-centered spirituality. In Buddhism, we have the tradition of prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom, personified as a goddess who transcends the dualities that imprison the mind. In Hinduism, we have the Shakti tradition, which celebrates the divine feminine power as the creative force that animates the entire universe. In Christianity, we have the mystical tradition that speaks of God, who is found not only in transcendence but in immanence, not only in greatness but in smallness, not only in glory but in vulnerability. In Islam, we have the Sufi tradition that celebrates love as the power that moves all things and that sees the heart, not the intellect, as the organ of spiritual perception. These currents have not always been dominant in their respective traditions, but they have always been present, kept alive often by women who found in them a reflection of their own spiritual experiences. And now, as more women gain voice and authority, these currents are re-emerging and being recognized as authentic and powerful expressions of spiritual wisdom. What we are witnessing, in other words, is not so much the creation of something entirely new, but the unearthing of something very ancient, a recovery of forms of knowledge and practices that were suppressed or marginalized, but never completely disappeared. a remembrance of truths that were forgotten in our collective rush for progress, but which are now being rediscovered as essential for our survival and evolution as a species. And the most remarkable thing is that this rediscovery is not happening only in spiritual or religious circles, but in practically every field of human endeavor. In science, where we are seeing a shift from reductionist paradigms to more systemic and holistic understandings. In medicine, where we are recognizing the limits of purely mechanical approaches to healing and rediscovering the importance of the mind-body connection. In education, where we are moving beyond models of information transmission toward approaches that nurture the whole person. In business, where we are recognizing the limits of profit as the only measure of success and rediscovering the importance of purpose, meaning, and positive impact. In all these fields, we are witnessing a movement toward values and perspectives that have traditionally been associated with the feminine, values such as collaboration instead of competition, interdependence instead of radical autonomy, complexity instead of reductionism, circularity instead of linearity. And in all these fields, women are often at the forefront of these transformations, bringing perspectives and approaches that have long been excluded from the dominant discourse. This is a moment of extraordinary possibility, a moment when multiple converging crises are forcing us to question the very foundations of our cultures and civilizations. A moment when we desperately need new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that can help us navigate the unprecedented challenges we face. And it is in this critical moment that the spiritual wisdom cultivated by women, often in silence and on the margins of society, is emerging as a transformative force. A wisdom that does not reject reason, but complements it with other forms of knowledge. That does not devalue technology, but insists that it must be guided by human values. That does not dismiss the achievements of modern civilization, but recognizes the shadows that have been cast along with the light. What these spiritually advanced women are offering is not a panacea or a magical solution to all the world's problems. It is not a promise of utopia or perfection. It is, instead, a more realistic and mature form of engagement with the challenges we face, a way that recognizes complexity and does not seek to reduce it, that accepts uncertainty instead of imposing false certainty, that embraces paradox instead of forcing artificial choices between false opposites. This is a form of wisdom that recognizes that there are no easy answers or quick fixes for the challenges we face as a species, that understands that true transformation is always a process, not an event, that knows real change happens not through dramatic revolutions, but through countless small acts of courage, compassion, and creativity carried out by ordinary people in their everyday lives. And perhaps this is the most important lesson we can learn from the women who have cultivated this wisdom throughout the centuries. That true spiritual evolution is not about achieving some exalted state of consciousness that separates us from the ordinary world. It is not about transcending our human limitations or escaping the challenges of embodied life. It is, rather, about diving more deeply into the experience of being human in all its beauty and complexity, joy and pain, challenge and opportunity. It is about learning to love more fully, to serve more generously, to create more boldly, to live more authentically. It is about cultivating the ability to remain present and open, even in the face of uncertainty and difficulty. To keep the heart open, even when it would be easier to close it. To continue creating beauty and meaning, even in a world that often seems chaotic and senseless. This is the wisdom that women have cultivated through the centuries, often without recognition or validation. The wisdom of how to live with purpose and presence, not despite the limitations and challenges of the human condition, but through them. The wisdom of how to transform even the most difficult experiences into opportunities for growth and evolution. The wisdom of how to create islands of sanity and compassion in a world that often seems to have lost its way. And now, as this wisdom emerges from the shadows and begins to be recognized as essential for our collective future, we are all invited to take part in this spiritual revolution. Not as passive spectators, but as active co-creators. Not as disciples blindly following a new set of dogmas, but as explorers committed to discovering new ways of being human together in this critical moment of our evolutionary journey. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps have not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the spiritual challenges of our time. Every week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. This is not an easy or simple journey. It requires courage to question established truths, humility to recognize that none of us has all the answers, patience to stay with the difficult questions rather than rush toward premature answers, compassion to include everyone, even those who seem to oppose what we are trying to create. But it is a journey worth taking, not only for our individual growth, but for the evolution of human consciousness as a whole. A journey that invites us to reimagine what it means to be human at a time when old models and narratives are clearly failing. A journey that asks us to recover aspects of our humanity that have been suppressed or neglected, and to integrate them into a more complete and holistic understanding of who we are and what we can become. The spiritually advanced women who are leading this revolution are not asking to be placed on pedestals or treated as gurus. They are simply living their truths as authentically and courageously as possible and inviting us to do the same. They are demonstrating through their actions and their way of being in the world that another way of being human is possible, a way that honors the full range of human experience, that celebrates our diversity while recognizing our fundamental unity, that embraces complexity without being dominated by it. Perhaps, in the end, this is the greatest lesson we can learn from these women, that true spiritual evolution is not measured by extraordinary experiences or impressive achievements, but by the quality of our everyday presence, by the way we love and serve, by the courage with which we face our shadows and limitations, by the generosity with which we share our gifts and resources, by the humility with which we remain open to the mystery that permeates all existence. This is a form of spirituality that does not separate us from the world, but connects us more deeply to it. That does not lift us above ordinary humanity, but immerses us more fully in it. That does not promise transcendence from life's difficulties, but offers us the wisdom to transform them into opportunities for growth and evolution. And perhaps this is exactly what we need at this critical moment of our collective journey. No more gurus on pedestals or masters on mountains, but ordinary human beings living with extraordinary presence and compassion. No more abstract doctrines or esoteric practices, but wisdom embodied in daily life. No more pursuit of transcendent states that separate us from the world, but a deeper commitment to transforming the world through our conscious presence within it. This is the invitation that spiritually advanced women are extending to all of us. An invitation not to follow or imitate them, but to discover our own authentic expression of this integral wisdom, to find our own way of living with purpose and presence in a world that desperately needs these qualities, to become, each in our own way, bearers of this silent revolution that is gradually transforming human consciousness from the inside out. The choice, as always, is ours. We can continue seeking solutions within the same patterns of thought and behavior that created our current problems, or we can open ourselves to this older and deeper wisdom that women have cultivated and preserved through the centuries. A wisdom that does not reject the achievements of the rational mind, but balances them with the intelligence of the heart and the wisdom of the body. One that does not devalue individuality, but sees it as a unique expression of our shared humanity. One that does not deny the reality of suffering and challenge, but finds meaning and possibility even in the most difficult experiences. As more and more people awaken to this broader and more integral understanding of what it means to be human, something remarkable is happening. An invisible network of consciousness is forming, connecting people from all cultures, traditions, and backgrounds who feel the same calling toward a more authentic and integrated way of being and living. This network has no formal center or hierarchy. It has no dogma or doctrine. It is simply an emerging community of human beings committed to conscious evolution, both individually and collectively. And at the heart of this emerging community are the women who have kept this integral wisdom alive through the centuries, often without recognition or validation. Women who, even when excluded from formal structures of power and authority, continue to cultivate and share this broader and more inclusive understanding of what it means to be fully human. Women who, even when their voices were silenced in public domains, continued whispering these truths in the intimate spaces of family and community. Now, as these voices finally receive the attention they deserve, we have an unprecedented opportunity to integrate this wisdom into every aspect of our lives and societies, to reimagine our economies, political systems, educational institutions, and cultural practices based on this broader and more integral understanding of what it means to be human. To create a world that honors and nurtures the full potential of every person, regardless of gender, race, class, or any other characteristic that has been used to divide and hierarchize humanity. This is the true meaning of the spiritual revolution led by women that we are witnessing. It is not merely about elevating the status of women, though that is important. It is about reclaiming essential aspects of our humanity that have been suppressed or devalued and reintegrating them into a fuller and more balanced understanding of what it means to be human. It is about healing the fragmentation that has caused so much suffering, both to individuals and to the social fabric as a whole. It is about remembering a wisdom that has always been present but has been forgotten or ignored in our collective rush toward what we call progress. And perhaps most importantly, it is about recognizing that this wisdom is not something we must seek outside ourselves, but something already present within each of us, waiting to be awakened and expressed. The women leading this revolution are not bringing something foreign or alien. They are simply reminding us of something we already know at deeper levels of our being. They are helping us remember our true nature as beings who are simultaneously transcendent and immanent, autonomous and interconnected, singular and universal. In this sense, the spiritual revolution led by women is not so much about creating something new, but about remembering something very ancient. Not so much about linear progress, but about integration and healing. Not so much about reaching some future state of perfection, but about awakening to the wholeness already present here and now when we open to it with awareness and acceptance. This is a revolutionary invitation in its simplicity and depth. An invitation to be fully present to life in all its dimensions, without artificial divisions between sacred and profane, spiritual and mundane, transcendent and immanent. An invitation to embrace the full range of human experience with its pleasures and pains, joys and sorrows, moments of transcendent clarity, and periods of doubt and confusion. The women who have cultivated this wisdom through the centuries, often on the margins of formal structures of power and authority, are now our guides into this familiar yet forgotten territory. Through their example, they are showing us how to live with greater authenticity, compassion, and presence, how to face the unprecedented challenges of our time, not with fear and contraction, but with courage and openness, how to contribute, each in our own way, to the healing and transformation our world so desperately needs. The choice, as always, is ours. We can continue down the path that has brought us to the converging crises we face as a species. Or we can open ourselves to this older and more integral wisdom that women have preserved and cultivated, often against great odds. A wisdom that does not reject the achievements of the rational mind, but balances them with the intelligence of the heart and the wisdom of the body. One that does not devalue individuality, but sees it as a unique expression of our shared humanity. One that does not deny the reality of suffering and challenge, but finds meaning and possibility even in the most difficult experiences. By embracing this wisdom, we are not rejecting everything that came before, but rather expanding and enriching our understanding of what it means to be human. We are healing the artificial divisions that have caused so much suffering, both to individuals and to the planet as a whole. We are remembering a truth we have always known at deeper levels of our being, that we are simultaneously beings of transcendence and immanence, autonomy and interconnection, singularity and universality. This is the promise of the spiritual revolution led by women that is quietly transforming our world from the inside out. It is not a promise of perfection or utopia, but of greater integrity, authenticity, and wisdom in our shared human journey. A promise that can be fulfilled not through some dramatic and sudden transformation, but through countless small acts of courage, compassion, and creativity performed by ordinary people in their everyday lives. In this sense, we are all called to participate in this revolution not as passive followers, but as active co-creators, not as disciples of some new dogma, but as explorers of this ancient wisdom re-emerging in new and vital forms, not as seekers of some final and definitive truth, but as participants in an ongoing conversation about what it means to be fully human in this extraordinary moment of our evolutionary journey.
You really not use a smartphone?
For many years, I just didn't have a phone. Then it became too difficult because, again, many services just demanded, like the bank or the doctor, that I have a phone. So I keep it, but I try to use it instead of being used by it. Not on me all the time. I'm not addicted to it. I'm not checking it all the time. I try to use it as a tool.
Why is it that after thousands of years of history, of developing, sophisticated networks of information and communication, our information is not getting any better? I mean, at the present moment, you can say that humans have the best, the most sophisticated information technology in history, and we are losing the ability to even talk with each other and to listen and to hold a reasonable conversation.
When I write a book, I would sometimes try to imagine my reader. And I usually base my imagined reader either on myself or on people I actually know or on encounters I had with students at university or public events or interviews. But this is a very limited pool of examples of data. When I'm doing it, maybe I have a kind of pool of information on a couple of hundred people. The AI that would write the book or the piece of music, it would have data on millions and billions of human beings over time. If the goal is to create a certain state of mind for other people, I just don't see how we can compete with the AI on that, especially as it will also have the advantage of being able to tailor the book, the song specifically to different people.